time wanted to come up with their own universal laws for how the brain works, how economics works, and everyone was coming up with universal laws and kind of making things up to meet what Isaac had done, but using very conceptual approaches. For instance, Adam Smith, and this is based upon people who have researched his thinking when he wrote Wealth of Nations, was one of the reasons why he had people be very defined economic agents with just interest in themselves, was that's how he conceived them as particles that would move independently without friction through an economic system. And what they found was that it really did not comport with nature. And one of the things that was known at the time, there was a situation that was not applicable to the linear mathematics of Newton. It was called the three-body problem. And from the three-body problem, this is partly where complexity science arose, because we knew the mathematics of Newton very accurately would predict the motion of two bodies in motion. But once you got three, as a title of a book, 2 is company, 3 is complexity. Once you got to 3 bodies in motion, then it became a very different situation. So the discussion that we're having today is not a discussion that has been isolated to healthcare. And what I wanted to do was just highlight where I saw the mathematics of complexity was working within healthcare, where was challenged, where it would be very difficult to come up with complexity, mathematical formulas for complexity within healthcare, and some of my own work of what I've done in order to try to address this issue. Because I didn't want us to get into a situation like Adam Smith and come up with a theory of linear rules within economics that just have turned out not to be quite true. So marrying conceptual descriptions and mathematical descriptions. Where we know that mathematics is working very well within healthcare is in terms of identifying disease states. We've seen from my own specialty areas, such as diabetes, to something as simple as walking, the movement in Parkinson's, aging, heart rhythms, and things like this, that we can see as systems become unsynchronized and there's a lack of coordination between different body systems, that there is a mathematically demonstrable decrease in complexity. So as these systems become disengaged from each other and start to exhibit disease states, they also exhibit a decrease in complexity. And you can find there's numerous articles on this in terms of even like something as straightforward as neonatal heart rate. A distress of a fetus prior to birth is that the heart rate becomes too regular. It should be regular, irregular. So the mathematics is very well defined there. Where we have been trying to extend the math, which I'm having some difficulty with within healthcare, is into precision medicine. Now, I attended a talk recently by a leading researcher in precision medicine, and I'm going to have to somewhat paraphrase, but this would be a very close paraphrase. He was touting the value of precision medicine by saying that we now at this point with our very large data sets, it's a lot like predicting hurricanes. We can predict where hurricanes go, and because of these large data sets with the understanding of the contributions of genes and lifestyle and things like this, we can then make predictions about the course of a disease within an individual. That, from my understanding of the mathematics doesn't go both ways. While you can predict the path of a hurricane with a certain level of probability, you cannot predict the path of each raindrop or even each rain band. So one level of predictability within a large data set does not mean that you have the same level of predictability at a smaller scale. So I have some problem with that. Additionally, just last week, I read an article about our friends, the bacteria that inhabit our gut. It turns out that some researchers have now found that the bacteria in our gut have an influence over our genes. So even if we can get a large data set with all the genomic information that might be able to predict our future course of life, our happiness and our health, that may be affected by our gut bacteria, which is affected by what we eat and the environment we live in. Where I have the most difficulty with, and I would love to be challenged because I would like this, as I said at the beginning, to be a savage conversation, where savage conversation comes from the Buddhist tradition, where the goal is not to prove a point, but to gain better understanding and to both deeply listen and fiercely challenge each other. So what I'm concerned about, but I would be very happy to be challenged to and be convinced otherwise, is that particularly within some of the leadership aspects and health organization aspects, the arranging of health, not so much the actual understanding of disease, I've not seen any mathematical approaches that really have worked, but I would love to hear about that. And I would like to hear from anyone who would like to unmute themselves whether or not they see health organizations as being truly complex adaptive systems and why. Any takers on that? What I'm going to suggest then is that healthcare organizations are not complex adaptive systems.
Oh, you can't go there. Let me.
Go ahead.
I'll take the bait for a quick moment.
Please.
All the different systems and subsystems, however you want to slice and dice the healthcare space, have identities and are constantly co-adapting with each other. So I think that's one of the elements of a complex adaptive system is entities that co-adapt, and they're constantly co-adapting. So that's really unpredictable in all the ways that complex adaptive systems are not. And secondly, the system exhibits emergence all over the place. So at the individual level, as a participant, transformations occur at the individual level, at a team level, at a department level, within roles, within organizational departments, and lots of unpredicted emergence at that. So at least in those two ways, I think Scotty Page talks about diversity. The four elements that are needed for a complex adaptive system to be dynamic are diversity, lots of agents, adaptability, and I can't think of the other, but all of those pieces are at play here. So that's my first hit on that.
Yeah, and the other thing is that I think that the notion of an organization is kind of like an old state, a Newtonian state concept. And I think if we really start thinking of health organizations or whatever, and see them as ecosystems, like there are people coming in, people going out, organizations that they relate to, communities that they're a part of. And so maybe it's the unit of the organization with those boundaries on it that are really kind of artificial, that makes it seem less of a complex adaptive system. But I mean, anything that's human to me seems like it's pretty complex. I mean, you have all those relationships, all those people, and interacting in different ways. And I'd like to hear why you think that they're not complex.
Well, how do we know we're talking about the same thing when we use concepts? I mean, this is one of the, this is not, again, I'm not trying to disprove you here.
Oh,
We can agree on mathematical formulas. I mean, those can be proven and disproven and such like that. Concepts, I do believe, also evolve and emerge. And there's going to be natural variation in how each of these approaches. So as we do studies of healthcare systems using terminology and a conceptual approach for understanding complexity, using the words adaptation and even complexity itself, are we talking about the same thing? And can or should we be trying to talk about the same thing?
yeah, I think that's an interesting question.
I was going, one of the things that I typed in the chat area, I think it didn't type to everybody, was that the fact that they may operate as complex adaptive systems does not necessarily mean that there is sort of that understanding and they're using the properties and the conditions of complex adaptive systems in which to change the system, in which to operate within the ecosystem. So to some extent, there's a languaging and a measurement evaluative consideration here. So as we start to change or have the potential to let people know what the complex adaptive systems, that language is, what are some of the measures that people can start to look at in which to start to have those conversations, and then that can potentially take that next level to be applied to what I will call sort of data metrics.
If I could just add, John Powell was saying, just my experience as a physician over the years in the healthcare system is that the formal approaches are really encouraging the system to work as a machine system, whereas the informal interactions between the agents are clearly demonstrating the complex adaptive system features.
Okay. Very good. Now, one of the things that I don't know if you're familiar, probably everyone here is well read and familiar with Geoffrey West from the Santa Fe Institute. He's one of the old people of complexity and nonlinear dynamics. He's been able to find, and other researchers have been able to find, mathematical signs of complexity in a whole variety of human organizations and human systems, such as the stock market, the organization of cities and services within cities and like that. But when they tried to do the same kind of mathematical modeling of business organizations, they could not find the same kind of mathematical signals, such as being scale-free and things like that. So if we were to have a data measurement of a human organization such as a healthcare organization, what would be those mathematical signs of complexity? I mean, we do have the language for it, but what anyone have any insight on mathematical indications of complexity within healthcare organizations? And if you do, you may need to be nominated for a Nobel Prize. I don't know.
But can we just say that if a system exhibits power law behavior, so a signature,
Right.
that it's a complex adaptive system? We generally agree on that. But is it true that every complex adaptive system necessarily exhibits power law scale-free behavior? I'm not sure if that's true.
Well, and there's tons of followed on Twitter lately. They've been having all this discussion about scale-free, and the conclusion I got that is the newest thinking is that scale-free is kind of an artificial concept, and that it's not really applicable to many human kinds of interactions. Did anybody else see that whole thread on Twitter about scale-free? And I've never liked scale free. I just think it's really it's a very small case that has been incorrectly applied to human organizations. I mean, I don't find that when you look at networks that scale free really works. I think the concept when you're dealing with humans that's much more valuable is self-organization and emergence than scale free, which always seems inappropriate with humans.
And it's also possible, thank you, June, it's also possible that it may not be universal. I mean, some people have tried to make other mathematical models of complexity, such as Fibonacci numbers and things like that, kind of universal as possible. There's not even and I would imagine that there's not even a universal mathematical approach to complexity. But in my own thinking, I truly believe that there are, as I've seen lecturers talk about, there's three basic ways to connect data. That's a linear method, random, and nonlinear. And pretty much everything within nature has now been demonstrated to be nonlinear. So one part of my brain thinks that healthcare organizations have to be nonlinear and complex and adaptive. But on the other hand, I find that healthcare organizations are very poorly adaptive and often retain very maladaptive and even self-destructive kinds of patterns of behavior. And I've almost come to the conclusion that healthcare organizations may be diseased or dysfunctional complex adaptive systems.
Right. And I think it's this boundary thing. I think as long as we think in terms of an organization, which is just a creature of the last couple of centuries, that we're going to get thrown off. If we don't think of the healthcare system as a network of all kinds of entities and individuals and look at all the sets of relationships, we are going to be really thrown off. And there's going to be a lot of disease because I don't think it's just a healthy or natural way to think of ourselves, this boundedness. I don't think it's healthy for ourselves. And, people are there's more cells in us that aren't us than our body cells. And so we're networks. And, we're finding out that our edges are much more porous and that we really don't mean much without other people and looking at those interactions. And I think it's the same way with an organization, that as long as you see it just as an organization, like there's these walls, I don't think you can make much sense of it. And I think it's going to tend to be diseased. I think we're going to see organizations changing dramatically in the next even 10 years. And they're going to become much softer and more, moats and castle walls around them. Anybody have any thoughts about that?
Could I just,
maybe I can add some.
Just in working with these businesses, these tech businesses in Cambridge, what I've been talking to them about as a principle, so this is backpedaling a bit, is getting around the idea that in the Homo sapiens adapting to the complex biological environment back in the pre-first agricultural revolution, we ended up at a point, a fair few of us, in an egalitarian sort of flat structure. So the hunter-gatherers were generally not very hierarchical. So our advantage to deal with the complexity was to have all people at the same level, all brains switched on, all working together, with individuals taking the lead temporarily, depending on the activity going on. And then when our human world became more increasingly centralized, with our empires peaking in 1922, I think, with the British Empire, sort of core to the world's surface, all that sort of stuff. Everything's broken down since then. What I was putting to these people was that, particularly in the tech sector, where things are moving very, very quickly, we're finding now that there is a tendency to go back to flattened all this holacracy, all these systems again are saying things in this world, in the man-made world or the human-made world, are moving so quickly and evolving so quickly. We all need to get back to not having hierarchies anymore, because they can't respond and adapt like flattened structures can. But then when you look at all these different, holacracy, all these different approaches, how you get people to connect and to coordinate, that to me is extremely interesting. And that's a long way from the mechanical models of command and control, and a lot about letting go and letting networks connect in almost, I don't know, can you say random ways? Not random, but you allow groups to connect in different ways, and you have self-governing small teams, all that sort of stuff. So I'm not sure.
Thank you. I think Michael Liebman had something to say.
Yeah, I'm actually trained as a theoretical chemist and the protein crystallography. But the point that I wanted to bring up comes from looking at molecular structures and looking at them as systems. So when I've taught at the university about the structure, say, of a protein, one of the misgivings that people have is they look at the structure and they don't understand that that structure is still evolving. And there are some things in there that need to be discarded over time based on a lot of external interactions and internal complementarity and networking. And there's things that are going to be added as well. And I think there are things to be learned, because if you look at this, the complexity that you see in these molecules, there are levels of organization that aren't necessarily always as obvious, but they do persist across a lot of these structures. So there's sort of a underlying set of themes that get reproduced and repackaged in different ways to achieve different functions, but then they still have to be adaptive. So you start trimming edges, or you add new things that are obviously not going to survive, with the expectation that you can, over time, start to trim them back progressively. And I think there's a lot of analogy when you're looking at organizations to that kind of structural inference.
Thank you, Michael. I've read articles from some journal articles from protein researchers who have applied the term Bayesian calculating, or Bayesian kind of knowledge within a protein structure, like a protein learns from its environment and adapts to that environment. And what's interesting to me is that I've seen that the same kind of idea, that complex systems use a Bayesian approach to continuous improvement in environmental interaction. I've seen that in child development articles and other kinds of systems. So there are some mathematical approaches that may not be necessarily within complexity science, with the scale free and that kind of thing, that have been used across disciplines to describe that evolutionary learning that you're talking about.
And you have to remember that just because you're adapting to environmental perturbation doesn't mean you're making the right adaptation. And you have to have self-correcting mechanisms along the way. And so that also continues to look at evolution, because when you have a student who looks at the complexity of, say, a hemoglobin molecule and tries to understand everything about it, what they don't understand is it's still evolving. And there's no reason to think that everything in there is perfect and that it's stopped changing and it's not going to have additional changes, and that there may be things there that'll never show up again in 100,000 years.
Correct. Because no longer fits with the environment.
Right.
Well, one thing that I think we can't get to this mathematical model until I see agent-based stuff, which can, help with some of the probabilities and stuff like that, but it's all very individual to individual. And I just don't think most of the world works that way. It's like you see little collaboratives coming together, whether it's, in our immune system or humans joining together, doing something. And so you have this agent-based stuff that's like more like little collaboratives coming up, doing stuff, coming back down, and maybe every protein or whatever molecule, are in a bunch of these. And there's lots of learning, adaptation going on. And I just don't see that kind of modeling happening. Does anybody know about that kind of agent-based modeling that's not just based on individuals' interactions with other individuals? Because I think it's a rich source of understanding, especially human behavior. And as humans are moving more into self-organizing, I think that would be really fruitful in trying to understand some of these systems.
June, I went to an agent here locally at University of Maryland. I went to a conference that talked about agent-based modeling. It was about a year to a year and 3 months ago. And the software may have improved since then, but they could model they could model a crowd getting out of a hall or moving away from a disaster, how a crowd might move away from a disaster. But if you put an old guy with a walker in the middle of it, it throws everything out. So it's very hard. That agent-based modeling is at this point, as far as I've been able to see, is still relatively simplistic. It would not account for someone going the other direction looking for a lost child during a disaster, and that would upset the flow of all the agents trying to leave the scene of disaster. Is anyone else familiar with agent-based modeling and know what some advances have been in there?
We'll have to put that on an agenda for another one.
Put on an agenda. I'd like to hear from people who actively work with healthcare organizations and taking complexity concepts into their organizations. What kind of difficulty have you encountered? Because I know you've had difficulty in explaining complexity and how you've tried to craft your message so that the concepts do come across both to those who think they know and those who have not had any interest at this point. How do you get consensus on the application of the concepts and your interventions?
I have something on that, but I've spoken already, so I'll wait till others.
Let's just see. I knew there were some nurses on. Anybody else willing to just share a little bit?
Hi, this is Margaret Carey. I don't really talk about complex adaptive systems, but I do talk a lot about polarity, dilemma, and tension management, which is sort of a distant relationship in my humble opinion, and showing them that the ability to hold two seemingly opposed concepts in their mind at the same time and to understand there's a constant movement between them helps them to look at things, for instance, like such as clinician satisfaction, the electronic health record, or personal and professional lives, or self and other. And I've used that with physicians for human rights, with medical students, and also with my clients. So, I mean, that's kind of a baby version, but I thought I'd just bring that up.
Thank you for sharing that. Anyone else?
I would be very interested in hearing anyone's even funny story about the comments they've got about what is complexity and what isn't complexity as you've worked with clients.
Let me throw out the piece about your first question. So Kurt Lindberg, who was one of the founders of the Plexus Institute, is the director of complexity at Billings Institute or Billings Clinic in Montana. And he specifically brings in complexity thinking to that organization, but he really dumbs it down. He really doesn't talk anymore in terms of complex kinds of cognitive sort of things. My sense is he does a lot of action, a lot of stuff that comes out of the book that Brenda Zimmerman and he wrote, Edge, and Daniel Pesut wrote on applying complexity principles in action on the ground. And I was recently in a conference with him, and he was really focused on the organization as a learning organization. And I think as a learning organization that embodies a bunch of complexity principles about connecting across the network, being changed and transformed by what you learn, and having really fluid conversations that generative conversations that keep people moving and learning together. So, I think he's taken the low ground there, even though he was ushered in by a complexity person, Nick Walters, to bring that perspective in. And I think what he's had to learn with nurses and doctors and housekeepers and everybody else that has to work together in that space, that you've got to bring it in a way that relates to the purpose they have in their work right there. And that is where I did my dissertation, is on the factors and processes underlying good team.
In the chat, if you look, Bernard Moore, maybe you want to speak to this. What would it mean for a healthcare system to operate intentionally as a complex adaptive system? Bernard, do you want to say anything more about that? And
well, it was my question. So I'd love to hear a response to that, because Bill or William was saying earlier, are we all using, since people were talking about this language, what was their meaning behind it? What does it mean for people, for a complex adaptive system to be operating intentionally? I don't know.
I'll speak to that. What I would imagine would be a system that recognized that there were gaps that were unknown, and that they worked throughout the entire system to identify that the information is distributed, and there would not be real progress or effective adaptation unless there were processes in place to gather the information from throughout the organization and from outside the organization to allow the best adaptation. So I think part of the intentionality would be almost a humbleness, and saying, well, I as the CEO of this organization do not have perfect information, and I must engage the entire organization and even my colleagues outside the organization and know which is the most effective direction to take the organization.
Fair enough, yeah. I mean, certainly I think most CEOs that I know would say, absolutely, that's my perspective and that's what I do. And probably if we drill down a bit, we would find that there is not as widespread an engagement as we might think is valuable. And I think we would probably also find that the mechanisms for sensing and sharing and meaning making are not as powerful as they might be.
Mm-hmm. So would you, this is my guess, but both Bernard or anyone else who's worked with organizations as clients, do you end up working just with the leadership of the organization? Because I would imagine that the frontline staff of any organization would also not be that familiar with complexity and would have to be brought into that conversation with those concepts. Otherwise, they would assume that this was just a normal command and control organization and they wouldn't participate?
Well, the short answer is yes. In the work that we do in healthcare, we seek to include as many people within the organization as possible, either directly or indirectly, in using as many mechanisms as we can use within the given constraints.
You know, it reminds me of the work, and Kurt, I don't know who else, maybe Denise, you can remember, or some of the others, the positive deviance work in hospitals, working on Mercer reduction or elimination. And that was very sort of self-organized. It was people who were interested and began to notice, you know, what was working, and that work was very exciting. Maybe I don't know if there's anybody else in this group that remembers some of that, but I thought that was very engaging and very much about self-organization and adaptation, you know, in a healthcare situation.
John, I certainly remember the Mercer stories and follow them closely, and the most outstanding thing about them is that they are unusual. The majority of activities in that area is still command and control. Leading from the middle and understanding conversations that individual undertake. It's really the informal areas and informal conversations, the most important ones, that create the collective knowledge. Our leaders don't really understand that.
Not enough of them, certainly.
Mm-hmm. I was just going to jump in just very quickly. I think one of the considerations, and certainly with positive deviance, was that you were looking at, you know, sort of small areas that could represent the potential to be able to look at the whole system and then make the changes. I mean, we have, even with, you know, one of the things I'd been thinking about recently was for those of us who have done change management, whatever the model, methodology, or mindset is, it is taking a system and making a change in the system, and then hopefully then being able to scale it or replicate it further in the system until the whole system is aligned. So one of the things I think that we need to start thinking about is that any change is really a complex management. So that we're looking at multiple agents, we're looking at multiple locations. It is a network, and many times they're dealing with internal and external considerations. The reason why healthcare, I think, was one of the areas that Plexus addressed first was because there were ways in which that they could deal with specific problems, MRSA, different levels of, infection rates. They could deal with, better care for women who, were in either a particular division or group, or pregnant or youth, and that it was a way that they could look at this and then say, how can we make this be something that can be applied potentially to other groups, and then find those similarities. So I think that, it's any change, any way that we're going to change any kind of system is dealing with a complex adaptive system if there's humans in it. So maybe it's a matter of also changing the language and then having people understand that they're already doing it. One thought.
If I could piggyback on that in terms of the Mercer business, multi-level, definitely. So at Billings, that's one of the 6 hospitals that had this fantastic decrease in Mercer rates because the positive deviance folks went out there and worked it at the ground level. But from a complexity leadership perspective, Ulbian, Marion, those folks, at the very top, there was administrative leadership, Nick Walters, who had a complexity perspective and said, I'm going to create the space for middle management to operate freely without being held back to bottom lines and stuff all the time, so that they could open up the space for the agents, the people on the ground, for the adaptive learning, emergent behaviors to come up. So that's where the positive deviance was happening. People were seeing themselves as a system and finding who was doing really well, who the positive deviants were. but they were protected at another level of the organization, and they were protected at another level of the organization. So all of that was going on. And one other ingredient that was happening, I think somebody else spoke to this, is the positive deviance folks, when they went in there, went in with liberating structures folks and other people to talk about the relationships between people, to create psychological safety, so that people could say, people could ask the question, boy, you've got the worst Mercer rates in the organization. What are you doing? With curiosity and appreciative inquiry to find out what was going on there. And you've got the highest Mercer rates of any department. What are you guys doing? And have an appreciative inquiry. So the psychological safety and the relationships allowed this bubbling to occur within a structure of positive deviance, but it was supported at multiple levels.
So Jim, going back with the Mercer discussion and kind of like and connecting gently to the central question of the conversation is about mathematics versus conceptual approaches to health. And in the literature, there is a very dismissive argument that the people who do concepts aren't really doing science, and only the people who are doing mathematics, but the people who are doing concepts in different disciplines around complexity feel like the concepts are a way of advancing the science itself. Now, when you're dealing with something that has proven itself, such as Mercer, one of the difficulties we find, particularly in healthcare science, is translating what works in one setting to another setting. What has been your experience with translating an effective complexity intervention in one healthcare setting to another healthcare setting? And have you found the same outcomes when you translate that or transfer that? Do you have any comments?
One quick sentence on it. That combination of the quantitative and the qualitative seems really important, because in healthcare, people are so evidence-based, they want to see numbers change. So some concept like relational coordination, which measures people's relational capacity across roles in organizations, has good entree. It's got numbers, you can see things change, but to actually do the work, the relational work, to increase relational coordination, requires organizational change kinds of methodologies and safety and all the good stuff that people do. So the marrying of both a qualitative and a quantitative approach seems to work over and over in certain situations. There's 70 different quantitative/qualitative studies that support relational coordination work across hospitals, across industries, and so forth. So that.
I agree with you entirely. It reminds me of organizational study about it was something very straightforward about how do you intubate a patient. It was found through research mathematically that the best way to intubate a patient was from behind the head. And then organizations tried to implement it in their hospital, and they found that they were not getting the same results until someone went out and found that the beds were bolted to the wall and you couldn't get behind the head of the patient, and so you couldn't implement it. So you had to have an organizational change in order to implement what was a mathematically sound healthcare intervention. They are definitely connected, from my viewpoint also.
Back to your question about how do you move some practice that's been successful in one setting to another. What I found, and it's not just with healthcare, but with many, many kinds of networks, is that the most powerful thing is to have a two-level network. So you have people, say, in different hospitals trying different practices and coming together in some sort of a, whether you call it a community of practice or a learning community, where they're beginning to share both, what's going on in each of their settings, what insights they've gotten. When somebody has a challenge, they're getting support. So that kind of setting where they are, and they're being able to get the synergies, like by putting one idea with another, that is the most powerful kind of pathway to transformation when you have the two layers.
We're getting close to the end of our time. I always like to offer something, and then we'll take final comments. I have a paper that's under review right now with the Journal of Nursing Inquiry, and how I've tackled the same problem that I brought up today was I developed a theory of health and nursing that uses 4 concepts, and only 4 concepts that can be tied mathematically. So I use minimization of predictive error, Bayesian modeling, biased random walk, and quorum sensing. And I use these concepts to talk about coordination with between systems and within nested hierarchies. So my way to solve the problem between the concepts and the mathematics is to attempt to use and define concepts, not mathematically, but that are tied to underlying mathematical formulas. And I'll take comments on that. And the #1 rule of public speaking is to end on time, but I'll be here after. Oh, really? That's the #1 rule, always end on time. So I'm taking comments, but I'll be available afterwards also. Any comments? Bernard?
Oh, yes. I just wanted to talk about the whole focus on evidence. And at least in my experience, it is a concept that is given a lot of lip service. But rarely do I find that healthcare organizations pay, and this is not unique to healthcare organizations, do people pay a lot of attention to evidence surrounding different ways of organizing and the delivery of care and its impact on outcomes in care. The work of Paul Uhlig, for example, that many of you, I'm sure, are aware of at Concord, has shown us that we can demonstrably improve outcomes through organizing the delivery of care in more collaborative ways. But that's not evidence that has been picked up on or in any way meaningfully impacted healthcare, for example.
I would agree with you. Mathematically, evidence is based upon certain populations that are selected and homogenized in order to take out particular causal relationships. And just because you find evidence of a certain causal relationship, it should not be assumed to be translatable into a different setting.
But one might at least be curious about its translatability.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
It's a place to start.
Yeah.
I'm going to be on, as now 2:00. I'm going to be on until there are no more questions or comments. But I want to thank everyone for participating, and I appreciate the insight and the wisdom of those who have participated. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Really.
you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So other comments, questions from anyone remaining?
You don't have a copy of your paper that you can share, do you?
Yeah, absolutely. Do you mean to send it to Denise?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Send it to Denise, and at least she can share it with us. I know you can't necessarily share it broadly, but
No, it's under. It is under review at the moment. I have, of course, 80% of all papers are rejected. So I've only have 20% chance of it actually getting accepted, but at least it'll be something that people can consider. I'll do that this afternoon.
Yeah. Thanks for a wonderful talk. I think the feature of reproducibility of best practices is just related to all the behavioral sciences. And I think the moment we start to think of healthcare education as not just passing knowledge, but impacting on performance. We are now in the behavior area. And what I'm finding is that in industry, the marketing research is very relevant when you start to think of education impacting on behavior and performance. And things like the functional MRI studies from Uri Hassan and others become very relevant in education. But the bottom line is that best practices, the idea comes from pill research, and it just doesn't always fit in the behavioral sciences.
I agree with you. Not only do organizations have adaptive and evolutionary-like improvement, but individuals within organizations, no doubt, is I myself need to improve in significant ways.
One thing I'm wondering is just people who are still on here, what is it that you would, really like to hear more about, talk with others about, building on what we talked about today? Anybody have any thoughts about that?
Can I say, just the mathematical side of complexity, I've not looked at all. I left maths behind at university a long time ago, but
yeah.
It is bloody interesting whether you can get back there. But just in terms of looking, like I've been looking at healthcare, just a small part of my focus, but one organisation over in Holland and the NHS over here in England, and the things that keep occurring to me that I just find interesting, and I've got no solution to, is we talk about levels. So we've got us humans, we've got us our unconscious. You can go all the way down to our gut, bacteria, everything that are all different levels and all different drivers as to the outcome of these complex systems. And when I look at the organizations that I'm going into, you've got all sorts of other things. You've got the technology and the systems. All these things are things that influence interactions and generate the complexity. And actually trying to look at a very large organization like the NHS, look at one particular part and drill down to what's the stuff that I can actually work with in terms of some level of modeling to help me understand these individuals in front of me. What do I need to shield them from, or what do we need to be aware of to move on? That to me is hugely tricky. And if you can't do that first line of thinking, you just wade into something and you're not aware of everything that's actually, or at least the key influences in a group. So I spent a couple of years ago integrating 4 purely commercial stuff, 4 businesses into one. And culturally and all the work was going well, but it was part of a organization of 15,000. And I found after a while, it just stalls because the group of 15,000 has certain ways of connecting, certain drivers going on everywhere. And I could get up to about 600 people in a group to start moving in one way, but it's like wading in molasses after a while, that there are some of these drivers that are just so inherent and stall the whole system basically in the end.
Anybody else?
Well, I was just going to make one quick comment, another conversation, but I think this goes back to some extent to Ralph Stacey's early work, where we were looking at any system being, the great XY, sort of diagram, that the lower corner here is where the system is close to understanding, close to agreements, where everyone's comfortable. It's the status quo. And in order for the system to operate efficiently, it needs to have a little bit of that. And then as it moves out in this direction, that self-organizing or complex area is where where the system really needs to be the vast majority of the time, understanding that will come here. And the chaos up here is where sometimes you need to push it in order to get the new information. But for the organization of 15,000 people, that little bulb, group up here of 600, you may have been seeing they were doing changes, things were exciting, it gets pushed down, and then it has to stabilize. And I think part of the issue is that when we address these very large systems and very large problems with people, it becomes so inherently individual and personal. And it's like, how many times I always tell clients, how many times have you thought, I just want things to calm down for a moment so that we can, you know, interpret all of this or internalize it or digest it or whatever the terms are that they're using, because there's a safety issue. And I think it's one of the things that, from a scientific mathematical perspective, it's hard to quantify. But maybe we'll do, to answer June's question, I would love to do you know, a pop-up on Ralph Stacey's work, and then how the system moves from status quo through you know, complex, you know, sort of that complex state to the chaos state. And we will see that there are all three in any system at any one time, and how do we as external people help the system recognize where they could be or should be at any time. And I have the recording still going so that people can listen back to it. So anyway, I'm going to mute myself, but thank you, Mike. This has been so much fun.
This was really fun. It was really fun. Great, great, great meeting all you, and see you again soon.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.